Hi, this is Erik Storsund of Brute Norse, and this is my VR to Dr. Mathias Nordvig and his video about so-called nature worship in pre-Christian Scandinavian religion. The reason why he challenged me to this debate is because of something that I posted on Instagram earlier this year, where I said that, quote-unquote, Norse polytheism was not nature worship, and I will fight to defend that position. So, yeah, as you already know, I totally dismissed this notion of nature religion, not only in regards to Scandinavian pre-Christian religion, but also to other Indo-European religions more broadly from a comparative perspective. Mythologies outside of this, I either do not know enough about, or I am not particularly interested in them, but I think that in a lot of the cases the same would hold up there. I think it's bogus. And I think that among all the battles that you could pick, Matthias, that you chose to die on this specific hill is interesting, but that is, of course, your choice. Anyway, this message that I posted, or like this, was really a caption, sort of like half-jokingly added to a picture I posted this summer, seemed to be news to some people. They'd not heard. It seemed controversial to make such a claim, which is not very surprising, actually, given how many times you often hear it being, reproduced. This idea that Norse paganism was somehow firmly rooted in nature, and this animistic approach where the sacred is seen all over the cosmos and whatnot, which there are animistic aspects to Norse religion, or whatever we want to call it. I will not deny that, but yeah, I will make that clear enough throughout this video, I think. There's also this notion that people didn't properly recognize the difference between the human world and, say, that of animals, which I think is a very bizarre claim. But another reason for this is probably because the public discussion of Old Norse mythology is exceedingly conflated with discussions on contemporary neo-paganism. Not necessarily between scholars, at the universities or at conferences, but I think in the wider public discussion, this is definitely being done. So we often confuse historical Norse paganism with contemporary neo-paganism like Asatru and that sort of thing, which is actively being sold as a nature-centric religion on the current market of ideas. And that's what we're talking about here, a market of ideas that did not exist prior to modernity, really. However, Asatru and pre-Christian Nordic religions, in case that has to be stated, these are not the same thing, of course. Asatru is a new religious movement whose concepts, terminology, and references are borrowed from our sources of historical pre-Christian Scandinavian mythology. The reason why I bring this up, because it might not be self-explanatory why I choose to do so, is that the term nature worship is not just an attempt at grouping together vastly different ethnic religions and propping them up against bigger world religions, particularly the monotheistic ones, but also to make it seem like the similarities between these are stronger than they actually are. A good example would be neo-shamanism and the pre-Christian religious systems of the Sami, which is, of course, a dead religious system. According to this sort of reasoning, Gardnerian Wicca would seem to have not only being reflective of the same basic attitudes towards nature as historical witchcraft, but also, for instance, Shintoism, which is horseshit, of course. Now, as far as the terms nature worship or nature religions go, dear Matthias, I absolutely agree with your opening statement that this is a heavily loaded term that reflects a specific and anachronistic way of looking at religion, which is why I am surprised to find you sticking to it nonetheless. I also feel that you are stopping halfway and not taking into consideration some key motifs and pragmatic aspects of Norse mythology and Viking-era cult. Now, there are many terminological issues, of course, that will no doubt have some of the viewers tearing their hair out, but one, of course, being that whether or not it is useful at all to use the term religion or religion in the singular. In my original statement, I used the term polytheism, which is, of course, simplification. The fact that I stressed this while Mathias might prefer terms like animism probably goes to show that we have some subjective differences when it comes to what information we emphasize. However, it seems to me that we both agree that the term religion is not very helpful when it comes to describing the complete worldview of someone who was born into his ethnic tradition in the 10th century in Scandinavia. In Old Norse, religion was not called religion. They might have identified it partially by the term siðr, which means custom or tradition and so on. This wasn't a religion in the sense most familiar to us. It wasn't a private concern, but part of the scenery that made up your entire culture. The concept of faith might not have made sense to these people, regardless of whether or not they were avid practitioners of the religion or not. The definition that I will be using won't fit all religions, but it will have to do. And I'm talking about the notions surrounding mankind's relation to the world and the existence of divine entities, as well as rituals, myths, and narratives that mediate between different powers and gives meaning, motivation, and context to our very miserable lives here on Earth. So let's define religion then as a given set of practices and attitudes related to such criteria, and with a massive potential for local variation, of course. As for nature, I will define nature not as the cosmos or laws of physics and so on, because under such a definition there would be nothing that wasn't nature. I will use nature in a more conversational and admittedly anthropocentric sense as the organic, natural wilderness and the things that exist there without any direct human or cultural intervention. That obviously leaves out agriculture, so that a field of wheat can be considered no more a part of the natural landscape than we can consider a dog, a wolf, for instance. So there we have it. Now, why do we tend to talk about some religions as nature religions and others not? Why don't we tend to think of Roman and Greek religion as nature worship? Surely there was no lack of sacred groves, because that is often one of the things that people sort of reach for with Norse religion, that they had places in the landscape that they would approach to do certain religious tasks. Of course, in Greece they were chucking piglets down into natural caverns in chthonic cults and whatnot, but I very rarely see this term being thrown around in the context of the Greek or Roman world. We can ask if that is because these were urban cultures, and then we could ask if Norse religion would not be a nature religion if Iron Age Scandinavians happened to live in city-states. That would, of course, be ridiculous. Ultimately, this difference between living on a farm or living in the city is a matter of scale, first and foremost. There's a significant difference between living in a cave and living in a house. So, it is entirely true that Norse mythology drew a lot of symbols from the natural world. You have the world tree, there are various animals described by Snorri or in other sources, and it is also true that the gods manifested in what we may regard as the natural world. That is not a matter of discussion at all. Thunder and lightning is an obvious example. Animal and vegetable fertility, sure. There are gods and entities associated with certain animals, or animals with specific cosmological functions. The personification of the sun and the moon, absolutely. I would have to be an idiot to deny it. But if the only criteria for determining whether something is a nature religion or nature worship is that it takes place in a natural universe, then sure, Norse paganism would be a nature religion, absolutely. The problem is that there would hardly be a religion on the planet that wasn't a nature religion. Even Christianity attached spiritual significance to certain animals, and that is often regarded as a religion that is antithetical to the world in a way, in a polemic sense at least. But Christianity invites the believer to find the divine in the natural world, where nature itself is regarded as a demonstration of the power of God, and God alone. Even if this world is just sort of a waiting room of sorts for what comes next. The gods of Norse mythology, on the other hand, are secondary instigators who arrange the universe in a certain way based on their ingenuity, and that's a different thing altogether from creating the universe. This is also a less gruesome way of saying that they killed the primeval giant Ymir and turned his corpse into their own little art project, of course. And the gods do not have sole dominion over the natural world. They are not omnipotent. You could say that one of the things that set the gods apart from what they had to deal with since the world was young is the fact that they are inventive. I think that by overemphasizing the mere existence of symbolism drawn from nature, I think that we are getting a little ahead of ourselves. That spirits exist in forests, waterfalls, mountains, and so on is interesting, but it only tells us that the natural world had a place in their spirituality, which is hardly surprising. The worldview was obviously informed by the world they saw around them, which would be the case for every culture on Earth. That doesn't tell us anything about whether or not they worshipped nature or found nature in itself to be particularly sacred or interesting to their spirituality, or even the entities that inhabited nature, if there was anything particularly divine about them, or whether or not, trolls exist according to the same logic that tigers exist or whatever, Even though a storm may be a symptom of divine intervention, this is not the same as admitting that all storms are caused by gods. I agree that pre-Christian Scandinavians viewed events and actions in a way that could be compared to so-called animism, though, that they view events as actions to some degree. Ultimately, our experience of the world comes from our bodies. Many societies have biological models for creation itself. The Norse world was no exception from this. As for the notion that people lived so close to nature that they practically couldn't distinguish it from culture and society, this is demonstrably not true. Even though these are our terms and not theirs, of course, humans have been manipulating the environment on a profound scale ever since the invention of the stone axe, and they have been able to distinguish between artificial and natural landscapes just as long. You yourself talk about the notion that Scandinavians identify the landscape with zones that grew increasingly wild and dangerous the further away from human habitation you go. That in itself would suggest, to me at least, that they saw that there was a fundamental difference between animal and human behavior and the zones in which humanity thrives. This coincides, of course, with the belief in primitive and technologically disadvantaged others in Norse texts. For example, when dealing with the Inuits or the Sami, who actually overlap with trolls in their descriptions. This trollification of other people is a common dehumanization technique in Norse literature and poetry to get the point across that these are not only people who are uncultured, they are hardly even human. This, of course, serves an ideological purpose that I don't think can be set apart from their attitude towards these creatures they're comparing them with, or the world in which they belong. Yeah, of course, the Sami did not identify themselves as a dialectic of animals or somehow being closer to the land than the Norsemen did. They considered themselves to be descendants of gods, living in a society, just as pre-Christian Scandinavians happened to do. We make a similar mistake when we imagine the Vikings as these noble savages that were somehow deeply tied to a natural experience of nature. I mean, a sacred experience of nature. Whatever that means. I too happen to believe that we are more segregated from the landscape today than pre-industrial humans were. But that also means that people in the past were much more literate in reading the landscape. as far as the natural world is concerned, living in a town is not that different from living on a farm. I already went into this. But modern Norway, for example, is dotted with spruce forests. Most people today would see them and think that they are natural forests, but they are not. They are plantations, and is about as natural as a coal mine is. So modern people tend to live lives free of the stresses and insecurities that most of our ancestors have had to deal with throughout the ages. Most of us live in urban or suburban environments. We work in secondary or tertiary economic sectors. In my lifetime alone, there have been numerous crop failures in Norway, and this has threatened my life and my safety in no way whatsoever. If we break our legs, we can go to the hospital. We don't have to worry about getting sick. This was a constant concern for our ancestors, and their experience of nature included a ton of unseen things. That is true. And many of them could really fuck you up, resulting in a wide range of taboos about dealing with the hidden folk that survived well into modernity. You already went into a number of these things, and some of them take the form of sacrifice, yeah, but I wouldn't go so far as to call it nature worship when you're essentially paying protection money to the hidden folk. A good example is Nordic brewing culture and the folklore tied to it, where the hidden folk were supposed to get their due. In many cases, their share was offered to them with explicit disdain or a form of ritualized reluctance. Here, you got your share, what else do you want? You know? If we cannot separate religion from the worldview and the actions of the Viking-era Scandinavians, we also have to bear in mind that these people were responsible for vast deforestation, hunting animals to extinction, and we're also talking about tarp production, forestry, animal husbandry, and textile production that goes well beyond subsistence farming. Good soil takes generations to build up and is ruined when left barren for prolonged periods of time. If anybody could spot the difference between developed and undeveloped land, I assure you that it would have been the so-called Vikings. In the literature we have legendary figures such as Olaf the Woodcutter, Olaf Tretelga, who created his own little nation by chopping down forests. Norse culture recognized that humanity gets by because we exploit the natural world and create things that don't exist in the natural world originally. And this associates society with land clearance. If we look at the Eddic poem Vålesbo, specifically the stanzas following the world's creation, we might note that society is also a divine concern. The gods go straight to civilizational matters. They hold council. They create the basis for a society based on law. And so they also do prototypical acts that make possible other future cultural developments, such as making tools, which can be used to make other things. They build temples and houses, making dwellings and the practical cult actually possible for humans to imitate. If they don't create the heavenly bodies, they certainly put them into movement, and they divide night and day and set it in motion to facilitate explicitly the measurement of time. There are also some archaeological finds to indicate that they perceived an association between technological advancements and divine power. In the Temple of Uppåkra in Sweden, they famously discovered surgical tools such as forceps and scalpels. I believe that this temple was raised in the 6th century, or around 600. You mentioned there are several examples of using natural bodies of water for sacrifices. Again, this is true, and I'm not denying that people use the landscape in ritual activity, and even sought out particular natural formations under certain auspicious criteria. Whether or not we can decree that this is nature worship is a question of interpretation, I suppose, but I think no. As far as we can discern an intent behind the wetland sacrifices, the water is the medium. It is not the recipient. Besides, many sacrifices were originally also placed on wooden sacrificial structures, and we have timbered sacrificial wells, temples, of course, and sometimes even the house doubled as a cultic structure. So there we have quite literally a domestic cult that is very hard to pigeonhole as an example of so-called nature worship. Even if the gods manifested in trees, let's just entertain that random example, we still have to bear in mind that they lived in lavish houses and spend their days chugging wine. The natural world is just the antenna through which the divine signal is picked up. It is not the station. Norse society was also a hierarchical society, so political power often presupposed religious power. As we may note in several sources, particularly those dealing with ruler ideology, it is not through some pact with a divine wilderness that agricultural fertility is guaranteed. It is done so by upholding the contract between political and divine power. The king is depicted as a god in Skaldic poetry who takes the land in a quasi-rapey, erotic conquest. If we go back to Olav Tretelga, the king who, in a way, created his own little microcosmos by clearing land, creating a division between order and disorder, we might say, we might recall that he was also killed to appease the gods because the crops were failing. This is seen elsewhere also in certain sources with other kings. The peasants did this, apparently, because they thought that he neglected his sacrificial duties. In other words, the well-being of society hinges on its relationship with the gods. When the gods are angry, fields are barren. Mother Earth is an absent parent. Well, rituals are also social rituals, of course, so it is interesting to note that the Nidingr, that is an anti-social person who was considered dangerous to society because of his behavior, is referred to in the law texts as a varg I veum, that is to say, a wolf in the sacred enclosure, a wild animal that pollutes the temple in a way by its presence. The behavior of these people angers the gods because it disrupts the social order, which is a divine concern, of course, and is therefore damaging to the collective as a whole. It is perhaps possible that these traits were desirable in the context of disrupting the lives of your enemies, but that's kind of another matter. If we see this from within society, these were people that are unfit to live inside it and belong out in the wilderness among the beasts. In the sagas, we also find instances where the gods are angered for other seemingly foolish things, like people walking the wrong way around a temple by accident, and of course when the king abuses his legal power, which actually occurs in Egil's saga with Eric Bloodaxe. The takeaway seems to be that Norse mythology considers humans as living in a contract with the gods that enables us to survive in a poisonous, uncaring cosmos shared by beings that simply don't care about humanity. And so the religion becomes a way of affirming this relationship to the gods. We have a sort of sacred duty to maintain our societies in a fairly stable manner. A lot of the sources we have discussed so far have been sagas, Eddic poetry, and of course the work of Snorri Sturluson, who wrote his prose rendition of Norse myths. All of these bring specific source-critical issues with them that we don't need to get too far into here, but most of these were written by Christians putting words in the mouths of or interpreting the ideas of their pagan ancestors. Eddic poetry, as you know, may or may not be genuinely pagan in their content, and as we know, this almost comes down to a matter of faith among scholars. I happen to be somewhere in the middle, I suppose. I have a fairly high trust in the usefulness and authenticity of Eddic poetry. But regardless, if we look at Skaldic poetry, we have several examples of poems that are more trustworthy, authentic products of pagan minds. These might communicate attitudes towards gods and nature and would therefore be essential to our discussion, you would think. And as it turns out, this is actually the case. When we go outside and feel good, many of us feel like the landscape reflects our mood. Smile to the world and the world smiles back at you. And if you're sad, of course, the world will seem equally dreary. We might think that this is a view demonstrative of the deep empathy towards nature that we like to project onto a pagan mindset. But the fact is that this very idea that we are mutually reflective with nature and that nature is the perfect ideal to be imitated is totally a Christian concept that we find no trace of in pagan skaldic poetry. In fact, pre-Christian skaldic poems demonstrate a strong antipathy against the wilderness in regards to human well-being. The scholar and poet Bergsveinn Birgisson wrote an amazing PhD thesis on the subject of nature and anti-naturalism in skaldic poetry. And he points out that in the pre-Christian poems, the properties of nature are always described as being diametrically opposed to whatever the human subject is feeling. The mountains never seem happier than when people die and suffer. Likewise, in Völuspá, as Ragnarok approaches, we are invited to partake in a sense of dread. But the giants are partying. Nature laughs in our faces. When we look at the sources for Norse mythology, we might find traces of the same. The name of the world tree, for example, is Yggdrasil. As it stands, this means the gruesome horse, or the terrifying horse. Ymir, the primeval giant, sprung forth from a prime matter that is called Aether, which literally means poison. We might say that Scandinavian pre-Christian religion is nature-based in the sense that it recognizes that unrefined nature is fundamentally at odds with our well-being. And this is in part personified, of course, with the trolls and the Jotnar. Let's just finish off this video. Thank you for watching. It is probably 3 times longer than it had to be, but hopefully I got my point across. Thank you for watching. Follow me on Facebook and Instagram. And Mathias, thank you for inviting me to this debate. Next round is on you. I hope I was not too rude.